David Crane first heard the broadcast on a misty autumn evening. He was seated in a worn leather chair by the open window of the ramshackle cottage he'd inherited from his great-uncle, a man he barely remembered. Evening light dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in muted grays and plums. Faint static shimmered from an antique radio that David had found in the cellar just hours earlier. Intrigued by its clunky dials and heavy wooden frame, he had dragged it upstairs and plugged it in, uncertain if it would even work. Yet there it was, stuttering faintly with static, as though attempting to speak across vast dimensions of time. At first, David assumed it was the usual chatter of a faraway station or the idle noise of ancient circuitry. But then, in the hush of that twilight, a voice emerged from the static. A man's voice. It was thick with an accent David eventually identified as British, though old-fashioned. Its timbre trembling with something that felt like both regret and urgency. The words were distorted, muffled by the low hum of interference, but David discerned a few distinct phrases: trenches, gas, and why we fight. He could not shake the hollow beat of his heart as he listened, unable to tear himself away from the ghostly broadcast. When the voice ended, it was as abrupt as it was haunting, followed by a burst of static and then silence. David sat there, stunned, the radio crackling softly in the now quiet room. The recollections of his great-uncle's war memorabilia flickered through his mind. An old trunk in the attic, faded letters from the front lines, a battered canteen. Now, this malfunctioning radio seemed to be channeling a chapter of history no one had signed up to revisit. He told himself he would investigate further in the morning. Yet, long after the broadcast ceased, David found himself awake, tense with anticipation for whatever strange phenomenon he had stumbled upon. The next day, under the dim glare of a single light bulb, David rummaged through the junk his great-uncle had left behind. Poking around in the attic, he found an old shoebox brimming with letters dated from the First World War. They were tied up with a fraying piece of ribbon, each envelope yellowed and brittle. The addressee was 1 H. Crane, presumably his great-uncle Henry. Inside, the stationery was adorned with British Royal Mail stamps, scribbled with anxious dispatches about conditions on the Western Front, requests for cigarettes, mention of shell shock, and thanks for care packages. Carefully, David deciphered the archaic script, weathered by time. He recalled transitional lines from the eerie broadcast. Gas, I can't see. That specific phrase haunted him, though he could not say for certain that he'd heard the voice speak it. The radio seemed to carry the shreds of testimonies from an older era so vividly, it was as though the war were still raging in some hidden dimension. Sorting through the letters, David noticed a pattern of references to disquieting events. A soldier named James with diminishing morale, the terror of gas attacks, and a certain Captain Reeve who had shown extraordinary bravery. Curiously, the final letter ended mid-sentence, like someone had snatched the pen away before the writer could finish. That evening, David sat before the old radio again. The sun dropped below the horizon, swirling shadows into the corners of the cottage. He fiddled with the knob, scanning for a signal. The radio coughed static, then clarity arrived in soft arches of sound. His heart raced. The same voice from the previous night came through, seemingly reciting a snippet from a field report. He heard the words more distinctly this time. This is Captain Reeve. Any Allied station copy? Gas shells overhead. Please advise. The voice crackled, frayed by time, but insisted on being heard. David felt the hair rise on his arms. The broadcast lasted longer this time, an entire monologue. Captain Reeve described the brutal conditions of trench warfare, the mud, the rats, the men coughing blood after inhaling toxic fumes. David could nearly see them in his mind. It was as if the voice were embedded with a psychic imprint, pressing those horrors into anyone who listened. Then, abruptly, in the presence of that same swirling static, the captain's plea turned guttural. Desperate. We can't hold them back. The men have lost hope. Some of them can't go on. If you hear this, please. He was cut off by a thunderous noise, perhaps an artillery shell. Then silence fell once more. Over the next few nights, the broadcast returned at the same hour, just before midnight, and seemed to unfurl the same events, though not always in the same order. One night, the voice repeated its frantic calls for reinforcements. Another night, it described a wave of mustard gas drifting across the wire. Each time, the broadcast ended amid chaos, with the same abrupt crackling and final hiss into emptiness. The routine took hold of David's life. He would forsake his normal bedtime, sitting rigidly by the radio, anticipating the transmission, as though on edge in a haunted theater. He found himself haunted after each hearing, burdened by the sorrow and terror emanating from a war a century past. Determined to understand the phenomenon, David did some research. He drove into town to consult old military archives in the public library. With the help of a librarian named Joyce, who had a passion for local histories, David started digging up records of British units that had fought in World War I. Captain Reeves' name emerged in a piece of documentation about the final push along the Somme in 1918. That single sheet, filed away in a dusty corner of the library's basement, revealed that Captain Oliver Reeve had transmitted a distress call via field radio on a fateful October night. The final lines of his message were never received in full. The entire platoon was declared missing in action after a mustard gas attack. No survivors were ever found. Intrigued but unsettled, David returned to the cottage that afternoon, feeling a strange reverence for the presence of ghosts. The radio, as though waiting for him, flickered awake promptly at 11:47 p.m. He glanced at his watch, startled by how precise the timing was. The routine that night brought him new footage of the war in his mind's eye, as if pulled from original archives. Captain Reeve called out for James, who was nowhere to be found. The broadcast carried moans and sobbing in the background, the torment of men who had realized that help was not coming. Their fears slithered through the static, each crackle of interference an echo of pained hearts. With shaking hands, David turned the radio off. But the moment he did so, something tapped on the cottage window. Heart-hammering, he rose from his seat and pulled aside the curtain. Outside, the wind brushed through tall grass. There was no one, only the moon peeking through a veil of cloud. He felt a chill coil down his spine. Each night, the scenario repeated. Whenever the transmissions reached their fever pitch of despair, David's environment teemed with subtle, inexplicable movements. Floorboards creaked elsewhere in the cottage. A door might rattle just faintly. Once, in the mirror, he thought he glimpsed the reflection of a man in a dated uniform behind it, but when he turned, there was only emptiness. Determined not to be driven mad by these nightly encounters, David embarked on a more in-depth investigation. One afternoon, he invited Joyce over to the cottage. She expressed a certain fascination when he told her about the strange broadcasts, though she confessed it sounded like some elaborate hoax. Nonetheless, she was drawn by David's sincerity and by the puzzle's magnetic pull. Together, they combed the attic. Beneath dust-laden boxes, torn blankets, and a broken rocking chair, they found a battered trunk with the initials OR. The trunk's lock was rusted shut. Joyce sized it up, then produced a small screwdriver from her bag. With some prying, they snapped the lock open. Inside the trunk, a British officer's tunic lay folded, the fabric eaten away by moths at the edges. Captain's stripes were still visible, though faded. Underneath lay a single photograph. A group of 12 soldiers in uniform, Captain Reeve at the center. The black and white image was cracked and stained. They also discovered an old field radio manual marked with notes in a spidery script. Quickly scanning through its brittle pages, David recognized references to wages of war and pleas for mercy. He recalled the repeated phrases from his nightly broadcast, scrawled in the margins. Gas shells overhead. We must hold. No help coming. Stunned, David realized that this trunk had once belonged to Captain Reeve himself. But why was it in his great-uncle's attic? Neither he nor Joyce had a clear answer. Henry Crane had served briefly in the war, but was discharged for medical reasons. It seemed improbable that he could have crossed paths with Reeve in that short time, let alone come into possession of the captain's trunk. Joyce laid a trembling hand on the trunk's lid. She whispered that perhaps Henry had come upon it later in life, drawn magnetically to artifacts of a war that had scarred him. Or maybe it was delivered to him by some haunted chain of inheritance. Night fell once more, and David insisted Joyce stay to witness the broadcast. He wasn't sure if it would even happen in her presence, but he felt compelled to share the phenomenon, lest he lose the small measure of sanity he still clung to. So the pair huddled together in the living room, the antique radio poised on the center table like an altar. When 11:45 rolled around, the static pulsed. David could practically feel the cottage's walls contract around him. By 11:47, that familiar voice rose through layers of blank noise, sorrow-laden and insistent. Joyce watched in hushed awe. She seemed particularly horrified when Captain Reeve began to describe the final hours of his unit's existence in the trenches. The illusions of artillery thunder boomed in the static. Muted cries for help soared and then vanished like flares in the night sky. Seated on a stool, Joyce squeezed David's arm when the voice spoke of regret. "We have lost too much," Captain Reeve lamented. "So many good men. If only we could have ended this. If only—" The broadcast ended again with the same tremor of finality. The moment it did, a breath of cold air coursed through the room. Both David and Joyce shivered. Afterward, Joyce confided that she felt the presence of something else in the room, something weighed down by guilt. She described it as a shadow with a broken heart. They resolved to try to help release whatever spirit lingered. They hypothesized that Captain Reeve was stuck, broadcasting his final pleas into the ethers of time. Perhaps if they acknowledged their regrets and somehow provided closure, he and his men might finally find peace. Yet neither of them knew exactly how to accomplish that. The broadcast wasn't a living conversation. It was a scar etched into cosmic memory. Even so, they pledged to try. Multiple attempts followed. One night, David tried speaking into a small microphone connected to a modern shortwave radio, responding to the pleas uttered by Captain Reeve's ghost. He broadcast messages of reassurance, telling the spectral presence that the war was over and that many places had found peace again. He implored them to rest. But the next broadcast came as usual, with the same tortured refrain. Another evening, Joyce lit candles and read a eulogy-like prayer. Again, the radio transmission remained unchanged. The always elusive voice still recounted the same horrors, the same regrets, as though trapped in a loop. Their anxious quest continued, and with each replay of Captain Reeve's final moments, David felt a deep dread settling over him. It wasn't just the broadcast, new phenomena were happening in the cottage. Footsteps sounded in the hallway while he was in bed, often halting right outside his door. Windows latched themselves without explanation. His dreams bled with scenes from those trenches. He awoke night after night, soaked in sweat and convinced he had heard men coughing their last breaths mere inches from his ear. The boundary between present and past seemed to be dissolving, as though the war had come back to claim him. In desperation, Joyce traveled to a small local museum that specialized in wartime anecdotes. There she discovered the record of a soldier named James Hallowell, possibly the same James mentioned in the transmission. According to the museum's files, James was from the same unit as Captain Reeve. His letters referred repeatedly to something he called the message never delivered, hinting that the entire platoon had pinned their hopes on a promise of reinforcements that never came. If that promise had been kept, the unit might have survived. Joyce wondered if this unfulfilled expectation was the regret tying Captain Reeve's spirit to this endless broadcast. Late that evening, when the broadcast inevitably flared, David found a trembling sense of purpose. As Captain Reeve's pleas filled the cottage, David again addressed the radio, but this time he invoked James Hallowell. He told Reeve the truth. The help you hoped for never arrived. It was not your fault, nor James's fault. The line was cut. Your message was never received. We hear you now, but we cannot fix what happened. We can finally honor you, though. We can carry your memory forward. The night's broadcast froze on a single long static hiss, as though the invisible presence was listening. For several moments, neither David nor Joyce breathed, waiting to see if anything had altered. Then the radio spat back a wrenching shriek, a barrage of crackles that hissed like venom. Captain Reeve's voice re-emerged, not in its usual loop, but in something new, a deep lament. A whisper overcame the static. "No, can't go on," and then a strangled sob. The last words were so faint David wasn't sure he heard them correctly before the interference blanketed everything. The presence faded, leaving behind suffocating silence. Whether it was progress or some deeper entanglement, David did not dare guess. A night passed without the broadcast. David was uncertain if that meant the cycle had ended. He found himself strangely uneasy, as though the itinerary of his life had lost its anchor. Anxious and sleepless, he paced the cottage, half hoping to hear the static cough to life again, but the radio remained quiet, dreamless. No footsteps circled the hallway, no taps at the window. Relief mingled with disappointment, a bizarre contradiction that left him unsettled. On the second night of silence, David found he had trouble sleeping again. He lay awake, listening to the hush of the landscape beyond the windows. By the third night, he began to wonder if some confrontation still awaited him. Humanity's regrets do not vanish so easily. A part of him suspected that the ghosts of Captain Reeve and his unit were still searching for an absolution that they had not truly received. The artifacts in the attic, the letters, the trunk, they all exuded a heavy air, as though they were not done telling their story. Just before midnight on the fourth night, David sat in the living room, the radio switched on but silent as a tomb. He talked aloud to the ghosts whose presence he had felt so keenly. He admitted his sympathy for their lost cause, his heartbreak that war had consumed them. He told them he understood that their regrets transcended mere victory or defeat, that perhaps it was about their own humanity lost in foxholes. The chance at a normal life severed. Words poured out in a hushed fervor, as though reciting a confession. And then, near the last syllable, the radio awakened once more. Static crackled, and for a moment, David almost backed away in fear, but the final broadcast arrived in a subdued hush, like a candle about to go out. Captain Reeves' voice emerged again, though fainter. "We tried to hold on," he murmured. "They never came, but we can't stay." David felt an uncanny pang of sorrow. It was not the repetition of gore or the terror of gas this time, but the trembling acceptance of an inevitable end. The transmission wavered, then continued in a barely audible sigh. "I'm sorry. To all of you, for all of it." There was a pause, and then something that might have been a ghostly inhalation. A final phrase drifted through the static. "We release ourselves." A gentle sigh of white noise followed, and the radio settled into a quiet hum. Its circuits alive, but no longer tormented by that haunted voice. David felt tears in his eyes, though he couldn't explain them. It was as if the entire tragedy slipped away with that last breath, leaving the air lighter. In that stillness, a shift had occurred. The broadcast ended not in chaos, but in resolution. The night's silence felt comforting for the first time since those transmissions began. In the weeks that followed, David and Joyce sorted through the artifacts with a sense of renewed purpose. They planned a small memorial in the yard behind the cottage. The antique radio was placed on a table draped with a simple cloth, and the battered trunk containing Captain Reeves' uniform stood open beside it. Joyce read from the final letter James Hallowell had sent, describing hopes for a swift resolution to the war. David spoke of Captain Reeves' bravery. Together they honored the memory of men whose final pleas had been lost to time. A handful of curious townspeople joined, having heard rumors of the strange broadcast and the centuries-old heartbreak contained within. When it was over, David wrapped the uniform in a clean cloth. He set it gently in the trunk beside the handwritten letters, as though tucking them in for a long overdue rest. Before sealing the trunk once more, he placed a small poppy flower on top of the uniform, a symbol of remembrance for all the lives cut short. Somewhere in that quiet twilight, he imagined Captain Reeve and his men finally stepping away from the haunted signals that had bound them to the mortal plane. The regrets, while never erased, had been acknowledged and given the respect they deserved. At last, The cottage felt free of its oppressive gloom. The floors no longer creaked with unseen footsteps. The windows lay still. On the first night after the memorial, David remained awake, uncertain whether to expect any final transmissions. Midnight came and went, with no flicker of static from the old radio. An odd sense of longing fluttered in his chest, tinted with relief. He was ready to move on, yet he carried an abiding empathy that he would pass along to anyone who asked about the old days of war, about Captain Reeves' sorrow, about how regrets sometimes echo through time if left unspoken. Though David would continue to live in the cottage, he would never forget those harrowing nights. Sometimes. He placed a hand on the wooden radio, half expecting to feel its vibrations, half hoping for a sign of reassurance from the men he had come to know through ghostly whispers. But silence was always the answer now. The final broadcast had ended with their last words. Their regrets had been heard and honored, allowing them to slip gently beyond the veil. Even so, on the rare nights when a thunderstorm rolled in, with flickers of lightning and gusts that rattled the shutters, David would recall those frantic pleas. He'd remember the voice wreathed in static clutching at the air for a lifeline that never arrived. In that flash of memory, he'd feel a fleeting presence at his side, the faint echo of Captain Reeve and his men. Then the storm would pass, calm returning to the night, and David would realize anew that some echoes end, not with a bang, but with a quiet acceptance. Some ghosts, once truly heard, choose to leave the frequencies of the living at peace at last.